Welcome, everybody. On behalf of the Board of Trustees and the staff of the National Museum of Bermuda, we are delighted that you can join us today for the lecture, Higglers, Hucksters, and Peddlars Informal Trade at Dockyard, featuring Dr. Neil Kennedy. My name is Lisa Howie, Director of Learning and Engagement, and I will be moderating today's lecture along with our Chief Curator, Dr. Deborah Atwood, and Dominique Williams, Collections Assistant. Please know that this session is being recorded and will be available soon on our website and YouTube channel. This lecture today by returning academic Dr. Neil Kennedy is the 9th in our Bermuda and the Atlantic World series. By discussing Bermuda's involvement and place in Atlantic history, we stay true to the museum's goal of expanding our ongoing understanding of the complexities of the Atlantic world and the forces that have shaped today's realities. As a core curriculum component, history helps place knowledge and lived experience into context. History is, however, much more than mesmerized facts. History nurtures empathy, promotes understanding of divergent perspectives, and builds comparative and critical thinking skills. The National Museum of Bermuda continues to develop academic resources using current methods of learning, which broaden the way history is approached and taught, with the view to developing lifelong critical thinkers of all ages. The museum's Atlantic World Lecture Series highlights contemporary, new academic research, thus building bridges between what happens in conservation labs and archives and research spaces with what happens in exhibit halls, classrooms, and on computer screens. This series is made possible thanks to our donors to the Future of History campaign and our Anchor Fund. Thank you to our supporters, and thank you again for joining us. Today, Dr. Neil Kennedy will explore how, during the early years of the Royal Navy Dockyard on Ireland Island in Bermuda, authorities faced difficulties providing supplies to the garrison, naval personnel, and local residents. Using sources such as victualling records, court cases, official correspondence, and newspapers, this lecture will highlight the often overlooked economic role of entrepreneurial Black Bermudian women, the tensions and regulations surrounding informal commerce, and the broader backdrop of emancipation and provisioning struggles. Dr. Neil Kennedy is an associate professor in the Department of History at Memorial University in Canada. He holds 4 degrees, including a PhD in Atlantic history from the University of Western Ontario. Dr. Kennedy's studies of the early modern Atlantic world shed light on trade, economy, and the lives of those who have been largely unrecognized in the development of Bermuda as we know it today. Dr. Kennedy has been involved in archaeological and historical work in Bermuda since the 1990s, collaborating with both the National Museum of Bermuda and Bermuda National Trust. Dr. Kennedy's upcoming book will unravel the life of Bermudian sailor Patrick Williams, a veritable odyssey from enslavement through self-emancipation and re-enslavement in the United States. Neil, we look forward to that new book, and we are delighted to host you again in our Atlantic World Lecture Series. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Lisa. That's a very kind introduction. Thank you. And many thanks to the museum over the years of tremendous encouragement and support to me. It's been really terrific and much appreciated. And in the case of this particular project, I'd like to thank as well the Naval Dockyard Society for their support. And thank you to the audience. Thank you for your interest and your time tonight. Now, a longer version of this paper will appear at some point, hopefully this winter. And so tonight I'd like to focus on the variety of sources we can use to think about marginalized people in history. And so some of the material about the victualling office and so on is in the paper, but I won't address that so much tonight. So tonight I'd like to talk about those Black Bermudian women who sold goods on the edge of Dockyard in the first half of the 1800s. Elsewhere, those women would be called Higglers, Hucksters, Hawkers, but those words don't seem to be used in Bermuda all that much, although they are quite old terms. We have very little information, I have to begin by saying, about these women and their trade as well. But I would argue, I think that they play a significant role in the evolution of the communities, the resident communities, in all their forms on Ireland Island in those formative years in the first half of the century. Okay, so we have to be a little bit creative in how we address these women and their activities. Sorry, too many buttons. So I came across two references that got me started thinking about the role of these women and their appearance. And the first one was this interesting reference in John Mitchell's Jail Journal, which was written or published in 1854, but addresses his time in Bermuda in 1848. And John Mitchell was an Irish nationalist and journalist who was sentenced to 14 years labor in Bermuda in 1848, although he only stayed in Bermuda for a little less than a year. Now, he was a political prisoner, so he was afforded some special privileges, both in Bermuda and on the voyage on the HMS Scourge that brought him to Bermuda. And so one late June afternoon in 1848, as the boat approached Ireland Island, Mitchell happened to be up on deck with the officers, and he shared their telescope and he looked out at Ireland Island. And he noted that he was dismayed to see the three prison hulks there that were awaiting his arrival, and the uniformed convicts who were being marched around on the shore. But as the sun set over the fortifications on Ireland Island, he noted that his last impression in the dimming light. And he said there, the skimming Bermudian boats with their black crews of marketmen and washerwomen have vanished under the dusky shores. It's a beautiful, evocative line, but who were these women? I wondered at the time. Now, as it turned out, Mitchell was kept separate from most of the convicts, so he didn't interact with Bermudians a great deal. So he doesn't say much more than that individual line. But I think it is pretty striking that later on, as he looked back at his time in Bermuda, his last impression on his very first day involved those particular market women and boatmen. Now, Mitchell's is one of the few surviving references to the informal marketing activities of these hucksters on the shores of Dockyard. Now, to someone like Mitchell, the presence of women selling goods would not have been unusual. Market women were ubiquitous across early modern Europe, selling goods to a great variety of goods, but to all classes of people. Their methods and their strategies remained relatively unchanged for a very long time. The word huckster appears first in English in the 1100s, right? So this is quite an old word for a customary practice. Right? And they sold a wide variety of goods, often from market stalls, but most often from baskets and wheelbarrows, the tools of the trade. Now, as women who were mobile and who were engaged in the informal economy, they were often, of course, not surprisingly, treated with the usual suspicions of women in those categories. But we know from lots of work that's been done on these women in the last few years that women retailers who were outside the formal economy and outside of the shops, in the streets, displayed entrepreneurship, agency, organization, and ingenuity in a trade that still to this day is associated often with those on the margins of society. And we have very good evidence about that the role of these women was widely acknowledged as important to society that is sustained, particularly urban centers in the early modern in early modern Europe. So there isn't much doubt, Mitchell is telling us, that these women traded on the edge of Dockyard as well. Descriptions of these Bermudian hucksters from after the period identify them as arriving at Dockyard by boat, quote, carrying their wares in large baskets on their heads, end quote. A former convict from the 1840s described the families resident at Dockyard as routinely purchasing directly from, quote, colored women who hawk goods at the Camber, end quote. His description adds that sometimes the resident families would shop in Hamilton instead of from the hawkers, but the markets there also, of course, included Black men and women as vendors. Unfortunately, just as in this quote, with those boats slipping into the dusk, it seems like the archival record of these women also disappears into the dusk at times. We don't have much at all about these women. So what can we do? I think we can still piece together a usable history of these informal exchanges from the few fragments that we have. The second piece of evidence, the second reference that I came across was a small slip of paper in the Colonial Office files. In 1830, a man named Leonard Stewart wrote to the Colonial Office to endorse an English fertilizer product for use in Bermuda. Now, Stewart was a Bermudian man, trained as a doctor in Edinburgh, who was at that time in the 1830s practicing in London. He claimed his authority came from long acquaintance with the inhabitants as a native of Bermuda. And that's probably why his endorsement stays in the files. I assume the Colonial Office received lots of these endorsements, but they don't often keep them in the files, but his is there still. Now, he observed that there was, quote, a continuous market for vegetables and garden stuff at the naval station, as well as in private families, end quote. This is really interesting. This really struck me because he's talking not about the sort of formal economy, the large-scale agricultural provisioning of naval stations. He's talking about small-scale marketing of the products of gardens and fields and provision grounds. But what was this already ongoing, continuous market like? What did it look like? How did it develop? And most importantly, whose market was it? Those were the questions that I was thinking about. And they're interesting, I think, in particular, because they help us think a little bit about how did those resident communities at Dockyard, or Ireland Island generally, interact with the colonial population, and how did they sustain and meet their material needs? Was there even enough local produce to sell? Was there a surplus to be available to be sold in this continuous market that Stuart refers to? What's interesting to me in the broader context about those references from Mitchell and Stewart is that they point to a real tension, I think, in the records of Bermuda in the Emancipation era, that is roughly the 1820s to the 1840s. Certainly in that period, Bermuda faced a restricted economy, partly from the after effects of the American Revolution, changes in the Freeport system, which directed American ships increasingly to the Caribbean and away from Bermuda. And so Bermuda responded with a substantial reconfiguration, substantially away from what had been primarily a maritime orientation. And at the same time, of course, there were major internal changes, particularly emancipation, but also the new imperial commitments represented by Ireland Island itself. And so in this period, the governor's reports are remarkably dismal. They paint a really dismal picture of Bermuda, especially the limited production of those few taxable commodities that the empire was interested in. And so we have in the governor's reports these quite contradictory expressions or conditions: high wages, yet few people employed; supposed idleness, yet food scarcity is claimed; local cash scarcity, but very high ratio of imports to exports by value. And so often left unclear, or always left unclear in those reports, is how were people managing if conditions were actually so dire? On the other side of that gulf in the characterizations of Bermuda in this period, there's the descriptive and the travel literature from the many visitors and temporary residents of Bermuda. And those accounts almost always comment on the huge variety of Bermuda's fruits and vegetables, citrus groves, grasses, grains, poultry, farm animals, fresh fish, of course, always. There's also in the port books, in the export records from the port books, the registers, large quantities of exported citrus fruit, lime juice, and so on, which go almost entirely uncommented on in the official records and frankly, even by historians. Notices of sales of residences in Bermuda in this period, such as the one here, frequently draw attention in particular to lemon, lime, and other fruit trees and gardens. And yet again, that garden and grove produce goes unmentioned so often in the official registers. In the travel literature, we have things like the Royal Navy purser Richard Carter in 1828, who spent 16 pages of his book talking about the variety of fruits and vegetables available and what he calls the great perfection of local marketable products. That's the material, I think, of the continuous market that Stuart is talking about at Ireland Island. Looking back from mid-century, even a critic like Ferdinand Whittingham observed that Bermudians of all social classes appeared to be engaged in marketing goods. He believed that market activity had evolved both as a necessity, but also as a kind of patriotic duty. And he said, just living in Bermuda, quote, is a business, end quote. And he notes that Bermudians devoted their attention to the cultivation of gardens and orchards, right? So I think the distance between those two characterizations, a narrative of scarcity on one hand, coming from the administration, and then descriptions of abundance on the other hand from the other sources, I think the distance between between those two things measures the distance between the formal and informal economies of Bermuda in this period. Now, the informal economy describes activities largely, but not often exclusively, outside of the regulation of government, and usually, therefore, often outside of the official records. I think it's those smaller transactions, the kind of thing that the travel and descriptive literature are talking about, the abundance of garden and grove and poultry shed and so on, that measure out the extent of Stuart's continuous market. There's been quite a bit of recent research on the Royal Navy facility at English Harbour in Antigua during the late 1700s, so a little bit earlier than Dockyard. And that research has identified the very routine appearance of enslaved women who entered within the fortifications of the naval yard to market garden produce and foraged produce to the garrison and also to vessels in the harbor there. What's really striking about the descriptions of that and the evidence we have is that it's quite a collective and cooperative venture in many ways. There's interactions with the soldiers and the sailors. There's evidence that they help the women transport the goods to the boats and to sell the goods themselves. There's also substantial evidence at English Harbor that the naval facility there becomes a refuge for fugitives of slavery, a route to escape either in the Navy or in other maritime escapes. I think we see some similar patterns of both labor and fugitivity at Dockyard in this period. In 1831, a parliamentary inquiry heard about Black Bermudian women who, quote, brought things on board, fruits and vegetables to sell, end quote, which is a pretty close echo of the pattern at English Harbor in Antigua. In 1818, an enslaved woman named Nanny looked for refuge at Dockyard for her and her infant daughter. This was perhaps an act of protest related to her recent sale and relocation from St. George's to Crow Lane. Her enslaved husband, Davy Tatum, was part of the Bermudian labor force at Dockyard. And those men were allowed home visits on Sunday. And it's really striking that this seems to correlate with him either encouraging or facilitating her escape on a Sunday and her escaping or being discovered to have escaped on a Monday. Now, we don't know what happens to them, and we don't know, I haven't seen much other evidence of Dockyard providing a safe respite to other fugitives. But what's striking to me is that for Nanny and Davy Tatum, they believed at least that the naval establishment functioned as a kind of alternative space to the colony at large. And so this was potentially a space between the Royal Navy regulations and the colonial structures and regulations as well. Fortunately, we have this wonderful painting of market women at St. George's by Royal Artillery Surgeon Dr. Johnson Savage from right in the period of emancipation. And if we look at a detail from that image, we see this wonderful central group of 4 market women. And even though this is the opposite end of Bermuda, of course, I suspect this is quite likely what the women, the hucksters at Dockyard look like as well. And so we have these colorfully dressed women who row themselves toward the harbor in this small boat that's laden with produce for sale at the market. Green bananas probably, or plantains, and in the basket maybe some dry goods or clothing or other kinds of items as well. And it's such a striking image because it so powerfully conveys that this is a highly independent and highly gendered activity in quite striking ways. And it also suggests, I think, the routine or customary nature of this in the responses of the men looking on around. These are women decidedly under their own command, I think, pretty clearly, right? And just, we don't know their circumstance. We don't know if this was painted before emancipation or not, but regardless of these circumstances, these are women who are making themselves visible in the public space quite clearly. Now, as you know, a remarkable variety of communities engaged in different kinds of informal exchanges at Ireland Island. We have Royal Navy sailors, we have garrison soldiers, we have the civilian resident populations at Ireland Island, we have the free and enslaved Bermudian laborers and artisans who were housed there during the week. In the 1810s and 1820s especially, there were refugees of American slavery who were resident at Dockyard, although we still don't know very much about those people at all, unfortunately. And of course, there were also the roughly 9,000 convict laborers from around the British Atlantic who were transported there between 1824 and 1863. And I'd encourage you all to watch Dr. Anna Mackay's recent lecture in this series on the subject of that convict population and their interactions with other communities at Dockyard, if you haven't already. Now, the history of provisioning at Dockyard overall remains still, I think, fairly sketchy, particularly in relation to local suppliers and wholesalers. Attempting to write his history of Dockyard in 1893, H.J. Carr discovered that nearly all the records in the storekeeper's office had been destroyed, pulped as useless lumber a few years before. And so, unfortunately, we lack the sort of records which might include those hucksters and hawkers, and as well the regulations governing their trade. We do have partial pieces of correspondence or collections of correspondence from the Royal Navy's Navy Board and the Victualling Office in London itself, in England. And we have some of the letter books as well from the victualling agents in Bermuda, for at least for the early period, the 1820s primarily. And so these are the people responsible at Dockyard for buying at the very large scale the provisions necessary for the garrison, the convicts, the residents, and the Royal Navy vessels of the squadron that were on station. Now, those records really operate at too high a level to tell us very much at all about local activity. They do refer to local conditions occasionally. They complain that it's twice as expensive to operate provisioning in Bermuda than elsewhere. They worry about the potential for theft from, particularly of alcohol, from the Navy stores and so on. Fairly typical things. They sometimes talk about local provisioning when in a couple of different situations. One, when the quality of goods is suspect, and secondly, when they feel that the few local wholesalers of fresh vegetables and so on and meat are unable to provide provisions at the scale that they're looking for. But when it comes to the smaller level, the more sort of marketable fresh vegetables and fruits, they just don't really say much at all. And they certainly don't say anything about these hucksters. The records we have from both the governor's office, but also the storekeepers and the victualling agents include a number of regulations to limit informal exchanges at Ireland Island. And that tells us a bit, I think, about the concerns of the Navy establishment and the nature of those interactions with Bermudians. And so we have early regulations that refer to boats landing during the day at the Camber and selling liquor to soldiers and residents right on the edge of Dockyard. And the watch are ordered to intervene and prevent liquor from coming into the island in those kinds of exchanges. Particularly in the early years of the convict establishment at Ireland Island, local officials were anxious about the reputed ease with which the convicts could slip away onto merchant ships in Hamilton and then away from the island if they weren't sufficiently supervised. And here Governor Turner is worried about this, but he's saying the only thing that stops it from happening more regularly, and it did happen, but more regularly, was simply that the convicts were disorganized, which he says limited how often they attempted the opportunity. What he's really worried about, I think, here is easy communication between soldiers and sailors, which might lead to information about security that would imperil Dockyard, and worried about the ease of communication between convicts and Bermudians. And so to restrict interactions, London prevented things like there was a scheme to allow the private employment of convicts by Bermudians for pay, and so that's restricted. They also restricted how much money convicts could hold on their person. And I think both of those measures are in part what channeled convicts toward the informal exchange of goods with those women hawking goods on the edges of Dockyard, as well as with the Bermudian laborers employed at Dockyard. The surviving records, that higher level correspondence I referred to, tells us quite a bit about the difficulties of supplying the garrison and the staff and the convicts and the squadron, but it surprisingly doesn't say very much about the residents and the resident populations, the families of soldiers and garrisons and the other residents living in Ireland Island. But contemporary accounts like this one suggest that people understood early on that the limits of the early naval establishment as it was being built and developed and expanded, and that the peripheral location of Ireland Island itself all meant that residents and soldiers were forced into informal exchanges out of necessity. And so here, a slightly later retrospective account suggests that individuals were forced to find remedy for their personal wants within the regulations and authority of Dockyard. That's one of the things I think clearly that's driving that continuous market that Dr. Stewart was referring to. There was, in fact, an early proposal to create a market store in Dockyard. So this would be within the supervision and the boundaries of Dockyard itself. And so in 1821, an English laborer named John Kingfisher, his labor contract in Bermuda is ending, and he negotiates with the storekeeper, quote, for purpose of keeping a store in Ireland Island and to supply the people therein with fresh meat, vegetables, etc., end quote. As it turns out, he was too ill, and he and his wife instead returned to England. But had he stayed and had his store developed, it might have very substantially undermined the activity of those hucksters at Ireland Island. We know that the convicts were enterprising in finding ways to engage with the informal economy, and not just with items stolen from the Navy stores, which is what John Mitchell suspected was happening. One contemporary description of the convict cults refers to, quote, hucksters' shops in the ship with a good stock of everything, end quote. Parliamentary inquiries later on describe convicts spending their little money, quote, in the purchase of tobacco, flour, groceries, and other extras, end quote. And they add that this seems to be in a reckless kind of manner. Now, those kinds of goods, the groceries, the tobacco, and so on, are almost certainly the kinds of things that they are buying from those hucksters and higglers at the edge of Dockyard. John Mitchell noted how common cash exchanges between convict laborers were between them, but also between the convicts and those Bermudian, Black Bermudian laborers and artisans at Dockyard. Now he's kept separate, so I don't think he ever sees the interaction with the hucksters, probably. And so through theft, through the counterfeiting of coins, and through their own mobility, convicts, he said, quote, contrive to carry on a considerable traffic with the Bermudians, who communicate with them on the various, in the works in various ways, end quote. And I love that Mitchell's phrase there, a considerable traffic, really strikingly parallels Stewart's own phrase, a continuous market. Now, administrators wanted to limit or at least supervise and regulate interactions between convicts and Bermudians. And so one measure was to require hawkers and hucksters arriving by boat at Dockyard to market goods to have a written permit from the storekeeper of Bermuda Yard. And so published notices in the Gazette include the phrase, quote, all persons permitted to sell on Ireland Island, end quote, which indicates some regulation was in place. But sadly, with the loss of those storekeeper records, those licenses, the names of the hucksters, how many women we might be talking about, none of that seems to have survived. And even the regulations themselves requiring those licenses haven't survived, it seems. Luckily, though, we can get some sense of the potential income possible in the informal economy from a story told about one huckster at Dockyard, a scandalous affair that was reported in 1857. And so this is about a Mrs. Romeo who, quote, kept a small huckster shop on Ireland Island outside of the Dockyard, end quote. Mrs. Romeo was married to a man of color named William Romeo, who we know as a sailmaker at Navy Yard for a quarter of a century or more. Between her marketing and his employment, they had, quote, amassed a considerable sum of money, end quote, as well as property. Now, the story goes that the aptly named Mrs. Romeo falls in love with an English convict laborer named Lodge, who believed he was to be released soon and was going to return to England. Now, they must have met through those kinds of commercial interactions on the periphery of Dockyard involving convicts making purchases and exchanges with hucksters. Mrs. Romeo headed to St. George's, and from there she absconded with the amazing sum of reportedly £800 in gold coins and the deeds to 3 of their homes. Partly by accident, her husband soon discovered that she was in Yorkshire awaiting Lodge's release. Unfortunately for her, Lodge remained incarcerated in Bermuda. On her return to Bermuda, she was refused re-entry to Ireland Island, and she lost her market license. And that's really, I think, interesting. So both the wealth she had accumulated, but also the government's very specific choice in her punishment suggests that the value of vending goods at Dockyard was widely known. Now, the story comes to us with the deep prejudice of the author. This is from Ferdinand Whittingham. And he saw it as a parable of wealth betrayed by a supposedly inescapable racial character. That is, he thinks she didn't deserve to wear her material prosperity so easily or so visibly. And I think it's really striking that the only name that seems to have come down to us of a Black huckster at Dockyard comes from this a white author's really sour delight in a tale that he thinks is about her making foolish choices. But we don't have to read the story that way, I think. In the first case, what's striking is that the author isn't surprised by the wealth that she's accumulated. Secondly, he notes that the English passengers on her voyage, her passage to England, accepted her as a gentlewoman, in part because she was dressed as one, and in part because of the way she acted. And so I think there's a really interesting alternative story to be told there, not the sour one that and prejudicial one that Whittingham tells. It's really then a story about Black Bermudian women's enterprise and their broad knowledge. Despite there being almost no indirect references to Bermudian hucksters in the Imperial Archive, there are a few traces of the kinds of informal exchanges going on that involve Ireland Island and the Great Sound itself. And so they help us see from below, perhaps, a history from below of those kinds of informal exchanges. And so just to talk about a single letter here from 1830 from the acting assistant superintendent of the convict hulks writing to London. That letter includes two different accounts of these kinds of exchanges. Now, there had recently been deadly riots on one of the convict hulks, and so Captain Boxer is writing as a kind of irritation in the archive. He's exasperated by the lack of discipline and the consequences. Instead, though, I think we can read these as a sign, an indication of how gaps in the disciplinary system and surveillance provided opportunities within the informal economy. In the first case there, Boxer complained about a Mr. Miller, who was overseer of the convict hulk Weymouth, who, quote, allowed a boat and 4 men without a guard to land an officer of the yard near Hamilton, end quote. And then the boat later returns and the convicts are intoxicated and one of the men unfortunately drowns. The selection of details, though, I think is interesting. Why was the boat allowed to proceed without guard? And why does he specify that the boat landed only near Hamilton, not in town itself? And I think that last part is an interesting clue about what sort of Bermudian was in a position and willing to sell alcohol illegally to convicts who were readily identifiable by the uniform they wore and even by their haircuts. Quite literally, someone on the margins is involved here, I think. The second of Boxer's complaints is extraordinary. And so this reference is to a convict laborer who is assigned to duties on one of the 4 islands that the Royal Navy kept in the Sound. And here, this convict, quote, kept a woman on the opposite shore where he was in the habit of sleeping and keeping up a constant communication with the inhabitants, end quote. That's an amazing sentence that includes an incredible world there of illicit interactions, sexual possibilities, directly linking a guy who's supposedly incarcerated with parts of Bermudian society. And I really like as well that his use of constant communication, again, echoes Mitchell's phrase and Stewart's phrase, continuous market as well. What was exchanged? Who benefited? Who knew? Who reported it to Boxer? How did he know? All we have is this very, very brief reference without any names. It's all that survives, a kind of floating reference to lives lived really under, beneath the gaze of the Imperial Archive. In both cases, it seems likely that those willing to consort, trade, and cohabit with convicts were from the most marginalized sectors of Bermudian society. Those with the least to lose from association with convicts had the most to gain from the informal economy. More typical are notices in the principal newspaper of punishments of Black Bermudians that relate to vending of goods, often either without licenses or allegedly with stolen goods that are caught in the boats. And so just 2 examples of summary judgments from just 1 month in 1838. First example is the most typical one here. 2 men of color who are accused and convicted in a summary manner of selling liquor to convicts in violation of Act of 1830. And so that kind of informal commerce seems to be happening quite regularly, and it appears quite often in the court records as well. It's interesting that one of those men lives in Sands Parish itself. Right? The second one is another near neighbor, probably in Somerset, this woman, Hannah Simmons, who faced a far more serious result from her unspecified improper trade with convicts, which was probably likely also trade without a license. The published notice of her punishment was headed, though, caution to colored persons selling on Ireland Island, which I think makes clear to us the targeted nature of these regulations, but also tells us who the vendors were. But for her and many others, the risk of discovery weighed less than the opportunities for exchange offered by trading with the residents, garrison, and convicts of Ireland Island. John Mitchell's considerable traffic, Boxer's constant communication, and Stewart's continuous market at Ireland Island. Since direct evidence of the hucksters is so scarce, we have to look more broadly. And I think we can see some of the evidence of the hucksters in the regulations introduced in response to the informal economy. And so we see that in the Market Act of 1834 as an example. And the Market Act was introduced in that parcel of laws from 1833 and 1834, which anticipated emancipation. Laws about vagrancy, theft, idleness, mobility, and so on. And of course, there's a long prior history in Bermuda, really from the beginning, of prohibitions on peddling goods, assumed theft, mobility, and so on. This became all the more acute in the 19th century in a densely settled place like Bermuda, and resulted from tensions in limited land ownership, access to provision grounds, and ownership of produce produced from those provision grounds. And so the Market Act begins with a really self-authorizing claim that there's rampant theft of produce and that there's an incoherence from unregulated selling of goods. And this is pretty typical of in the Caribbean at the same time as well. And so the Market Act was intended to specify particular days and spaces in both Hamilton and St. George's, each with supervising market constables and record keeping of cash exchanges, right? So this was to reward meritorious producers of produce. The law is really, I think, reflecting this desire to demarcate space and interaction by bringing informal exchanges under surveillance. What's interesting, though, is that an appendix to the Market Act, this one here, suggests how difficult it was to actually regulate the kind of trade that the hucksters were engaged in at that waterborne trade, essentially, both at Dockyard, but also on those 4 Navy islands in the Sound, and also on Navy ships within the Sound itself, vessels at anchor. And so the scale and the fluid nature of the hucksters' trade meant that in this appendix, the hawkers at Dockyard and in the Sound were allowed to go unrecorded. The boatmen, however, were required to have a license, and there's an effort to try and limit their hours and regulate their trade and record their trade a little bit, but the hucksters are left out of that regulation, which is kind of interesting. And so I think we can see there a tension between what historians would call rival geographies, right? One that's fixed in space and regulation in the Market Act, and another that emphasizes mobility and transaction. It's interesting, too, that the Market Act is one of those acts that drew the attention of the Colonial Office in 1838 when they reviewed laws in the colonies that were believed to be disproportionately affecting people of color. And so they reviewed the Market Act, the Vagrancy Act, the Larceny Act, and a variety of others. And they deemed them to be excessively stringent, even compared to the Caribbean. And so the Colonial Office says the Market Act promoted what they called invidious distinctions between social groups by presuming the guilt of people caught with or discovered with produce, by summary justice, by disproportionate punishments and burdensome proofs of ownership of produce, and so on. Lord Glenelg, the colonial secretary himself, identified the racially targeted nature of the Market Act and how unfairly it restricted people in the informal economy and its operation. And he said, quote, "It placed much arbitrary and unnecessary restrictions on the sale of the commonest articles of consumption, and it imposed a check so injurious to the industry of the poorer classes." And he asked that it be repealed. I think if we cast our net further afield, which we must do in this case, we can see other examples of rival conceptions of exchange value in Bermuda, just like the Market Act. During her time in Bermuda between 1829 and 1831, young English educational reformer Suzette Harriet Lloyd recorded the habits, the material culture, and the exchange activities of enslaved Bermudians. And she does this with what's really striking insensitivity at times. In a typical example, she pestered an older black cook named Penny for botanical remedies. Not getting what she wants, Lloyd interpreted Penny's response as peevish, even childlike, I think. But maybe Penny wasn't just exasperated with Lloyd. I think that within the limits afforded her, Penny was protecting information with real exchange value. And Lloyd herself is telling us that when she says that she herself received benefit from the great variety of botanical remedies known to the Black population. If we go a little bit even further afield, Mary Prince's autobiography shows us how commercial skills learned or observed in Bermuda and the politics they expressed could be applied elsewhere. Shortly after arriving in Antigua around 1815, Prince began to engage in what historian Natasha Lightfoot calls, quote, "the subversive possibilities of huckstering," end quote. Through informal trade in urban and port spaces in St. John's, Prince repurposed knowledge gained in horticulture and animal husbandry in Bermuda. And so she writes that she sold yams and coffee and other provisions to the captains of ships. And her success at it supported her desire to escape enslavement, while the maritime dimension brought access to goods as well as contact with sources of capital that she tried to use to free herself. In 1848, Mitchell observed those hucksters' boats disappearing from sight into the dusk, and it may well have been that he was observing, in some ways, at least metaphorically, the dwindling years of huckstering at Dockyard. From the 1850s on, it seems references to the presence of hawkers and hucksters at Dockyard begin to disappear. Why, though? I think the continued growth of the naval establishment, with expanding medical and residential facilities, the completion of the enormous victualling yard in 1848, all brought an elaboration of services and goods within Ireland Island. The Deputy General's report from 1853 refers to a market house within Dockyard proper, along with soda water factory and the milk cellar and so on. And those probably together replaced many of the functions provided by the black hucksters. The growth of retailers in Somerset and Hamilton probably also contributed to the decline of Bermudian huckstering at Dockyard. Probably, maybe also Governor William Reed's efforts to expand agricultural production in Bermuda may have shifted the local contribution of provisioning away from small exchanges into larger, more formal the tendering process for buying provisions. It's not really clear. He encourages kitchen gardens in the garrison. He proposes fresh Bermuda caught fish, and so on, both things that would have bypassed the hucksters to some extent. Certainly, no, the single biggest factor, I think, that brought an end to Bermuda's participation, the hucksters' participation, is probably the end of the convict labor system in 1863. That abruptly ended one of the most substantial populations for informal commercial exchanges with the hucksters. A restless population of often up to 1,000 men at any one time, at its height at least, fairly lightly supervised in a fairly open site. The loss of that population was a great loss to those exchange opportunities, I think. Nonetheless, we have traces, right? This nanny illustrated here in the 1850s, proximate to but apart from this resident family at Dockyard, right? So of course the black presence doesn't end, but is perhaps transformed in a variety of ways. Even as huckstering at Dockyard may have faded, certainly, of course, black women continue to participate in and shape the informal economy in Bermuda from both necessity and opportunity. Whether at Dockyard or elsewhere, these women organized supply and credit. They combined local knowledge and expertise into flexible commercial exchanges. And above all else, they made themselves visible in public spaces. And by doing so, these women engaged in a politics of resistance against marginalization. That unnamed woman on the island in Great Sound, who was an intermediary between convict and inhabitants, measured the boundary between fixed and fluid conceptions of space and exchange. Mrs. Romeo, that wayward huckster, she demonstrated the material potential of huckstering and the mobility and knowledge that experience gave. It's often said that the marginalized are silent in the archive, but that's rarely the case. Often they're there only as the slightest paper traces, like the hucksters, but they're there nonetheless. Thank you very much for your time.
I wish you'd been my history teacher.
Well, thank you.
Very entertaining as well as informative. Neil, your story as a lecturer reminds me of something the museum likes to position, which is how objects tell stories. And I was speaking with my mother the other day, and we were talking about the house on Mount Hill that's still in the family. And the house on Mount Hill as an object, the story behind it is actually that my great-grandmother, her grandmother, Rosa Simons, S-I-M-O-N-S, similar to the name that you said, and that she was selling food that she made in her own kitchen in the house that is right beside Cavello Bay, where her husband was a former police officer and lantern lighter at Cavello Bay. And so she was a talented cook who grew her own garden, and she was hired as a cook, and then she would make additional meals and sell those prepared meals at Cavello Bay at the end of the day when the laborers came home. And she was able to accrue enough money. We reckon this is circa, we're kind of looking for dates, 1920, 1930.
Wow. Yes.
And she
Wonderful.
was able to accrue enough cash to buy her home on Mount Hill in Pembroke, and it still
Yeah.
remains in the family. And it's just quite fascinating when you think about this. And I know we're talking a century prior in the Emancipation era,
Mhm, mhm,
but that go-gettership, that
mhm,
huckster
mhm.
out attitude, really to
Right.
push through out of the circumstance and to rise above. I just find it still remarkable today.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. That's a wonderful story, and it also speaks to something I said at the very beginning, that the practices and traditions stayed relatively unchanged for a very, very long time because they were effective. Obviously, they were effective, or
Mhm.
they would have changed. Right? And your story reminds me that one of the things the research on hucksters in early modern Europe has suggested is that despite that characterization of that these were young women who were prone to engaging in suspect behaviors because of their
Mhm.
mobility, it's actually very often a practice engaged in by married women.
Mm. Well, I've got a different question for you before
Oh,
others, I hope, leap in with questions. And I was we were in a little museum chat while we're talking, and
mm,
we're wondering about the cost of the market license. Do you
mm,
know what that would be? And also, what would that relative value be today?
mhm,
And you also
mhm,
mentioned that the market license was really essentially for the boat owners and those trafficking goods on the water. Were there, and do you know the history on when the market license
mhm,
for the on land
mhm.
hucksters would have been available?
Right. The only evidence we really have of them comes from the ads in the Gazette, right? And so the ads in the Gazette that are essentially tenders for people to sell produce at fresh produce at Dockyard begin to include that note about a permit being required. As I recall, around 1826, 1827, so at some point in there. And so the earlier than the Market Act, for instance, which is the one that requires the boatmen to have the licenses, but doesn't refer to the women themselves, only refers to the boats. And so this predates that. Unfortunately, I mean, I haven't had an exhaustive search of it, but as far as I can tell, none of those notices refer to the cost of the license. And so, the loss of those storekeeper records has really sets us back, I think, from looking at potentially if those records had included that kind of information, the names of the women, the prices of the licenses, and how often it was the same. I suspect there was a considerable persistence of women in those roles. But we just don't know. They just don't survive, and so I'm unable to guess. In comparison to, say, examples from early modern Europe, most of the evidence is that the license fee is relatively nominal. And so that suggests it serves more of a regulatory and sort of surveillance function than it
Hmm.
does a kind of prohibition or a kind of restrictive thing.
Yeah, we actually are still quite restrictive on street busking.
Mm,
And you probably know that it's
mhm,
quite regulated today.
mm, yeah.
Um, just wanting to know if there are any other questions that are coming through from the audience. One of the questions we were also thinking about is, have we got any I mean, you've talked about the market goods, you've talked about, fruit. We see the picture here, which by the way, I think is
Oh,
fabulous. I'd love to know
sorry.
the date on that picture too. But
Yes.
I was just thinking about, were there any, I would think about what other goods were being traded. Were there, because we have this whole privateering
Mhm,
that was also happening,
mhm,
um, were you aware of any international objects that would have been sold versus those grown here?
mhm, mhm,
Yeah.
mhm. I'm not sure. Perhaps the tobacco and much of the alcohol would be included in that. I
Mhm.
mean, it depend on the amount of tobacco that there's certainly the parliamentary inquiry lists tobacco and alcohol as some of the items, and so I suspect some of that is coming from outside, quite likely. What's interesting is we have better evidence of goods that leave Bermuda going the in the other direction. And so there's a report in the middle part of the century from one supervisor of the convicts who notes there's a great demand for the jewelry and the stone carvings and so on. And there's even taxidermied birds that are being produced by convicts and sold. And I suspect most of those goods are being exchanged with hucksters for the produce and tobacco and alcohol and other kinds of goods. And he notes that the demand for those convict produced goods passes beyond Bermuda, so implying that there's a kind of Atlantic market for those goods. And so the evidence is so thin for any of the activities of these hucksters, but there is evidence that some of those goods are going kind of internationally or certainly inter-imperially in the other direction. There's some, one of the difficulties in thinking about these exchanges is it's very hard to separate what the women were selling from what the men, the artisans and laborers who were working at Dockyard, from what they were exchanging as well. And one of the parliamentary inquiries reports that some of these artisans were burying alcohol in known locations for the convicts to pick up secretly. And so there were some things that were probably more in the male domain than the hucksters. But again, it's not always clear. There are some references that I think are maybe have to be taken with a grain of salt, that there's a substantial trade in erotic pictures and books. That's Royal Navy sailors are selling to garrison soldiers, or trading with garrison soldiers, who then trade them to convicts, who then trade them to Bermudians. And I suspect that sort of thing is probably what the male artisans and laborers are involved in, not the hucksters. But otherwise, it's a little bit. One of the items I find really interesting is a convict report from the 1840s. And he notes that despite the convicts being issued a uniform with the Queen's broad arrow, the blue arrow on the back, and so on, and a straw hat, that some of the young convicts refused that clothing and chose to purchase their own clothing. And so they bought lighter shoes and cotton garments. And he specifies that they purchased them themselves. And so they would have to have been doing that from these hucksters. And I think one of the signs of that is he refers to them wearing these, what he calls brab hats, B-R-A-B. And brab is an older Mediterranean word for the Palmyra palm. And it's, I think, clearly a reference to palmetto frond hats. And so they're rejecting the straw hats for palmetto frond hats, but they almost certainly are buying from these hucksters.
Just to jump in, I was thinking about the clothing in one of the articles in the syllabus. There's a reference to people, or a particular woman, who took the mosquito nets down and fashioned a dress only to use it for a party, and then of course disassemble it to return it to the mosquito nets, which for me is thinking, I'm okay, maybe these are mosquito nets, but I wonder if she had been interacting with silk. Mark Kalansky's Silk takes us on a it's not Mark Kurlansky, it's another writer, but takes us on this wonderful journey about silk, and it really completely alters perceptions. And it just made me wonder I wonder if silk had been coming through Bermuda, and that while this particular person couldn't find it, they liked the idea, and I can imagine the mosquito nets satisfying that.
Right. Yeah, it's very likely.
I don't know. More questions. Do you have the date on this, Nikki Lusher? Any Lusher photograph?
No.
Okay.
Carla suspects, I think 1880s, 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. Yeah, it's hard to tell. It's a wonderful pictures. Again, it just, these are women asserting themselves in the public space, right? Making themselves visible and making themselves present, where in other categories, other records, they are so marginalized and so moved to the margins.
Yeah, and it has a distinct echo of Black women's presence in the protests against segregation. We could juxtapose the photograph from one era to the next to see women continuing to evolve our society in such a strong way.
Absolutely.
I just want to chime in again to the audience. We've got the most wonderful Dr. Neil Kennedy here. If you have questions, or actually if you also have anecdotes, that was what I was also thinking about, Neil, is whether or not, this idea of when the history no longer exists, the files perhaps have been, pulverized. Is there still a call for community storytelling, right? Because this story is right on the tip of the tongue of my mom.
Right.
Born in 1940, and surely there are others in our community who would know that there are these fabulous stories, and perhaps they have singular objects that actually are reflecting sort of that market evolution from one generation to the next, and they're still held in hand. Yeah,
that would be wonderful. I mean, clearly the museum itself has some of those convict carvings and the bits of the jewelry and so on, and the counterfeiting of coins and so on. But yeah, the stories would be really interesting. It makes me think of how were Black women involved in other aspects of the informal economy around the same time. And it makes me think of Michael Bradshaw's work on the confraternities and the social organizations. And my co-author, Sarah Hannon, is working now on some of the women's organizations in the 1840s and 1850s, like the Female Charitable Union Society and their activities in catering, right? This really quite extensive catering business that's just really evidenced in the Gazette, in the advertisements. and notices and so on, but it's clearly quite extensive. And also the tea meetings, right? The tea meetings, which were also very political, right? Especially in the Caribbean, where the tradition is better known. Tea meetings, which were about social and political functions of these women and leaders in their communities, and so on. Or the black run eating houses like Charlotte and Richard Tucker's in Hamilton in the 1830s, right? There are all these ways in which the informal economy, or Michael Bradshaw said to me once, the informal economy is what gives character to places. And I think he's so right. And so it'd be wonderful to have those oral histories collected. I wonder a little bit whether, to some extent, maybe what's happening though is those women involved in the things like the Female Charitable Union Society, because they're leaders in the community, there's a kind of language of respectability that enters into the informal economy and things like the catering business and so on, which may have had a limiting effect perhaps on the hucksters at Dockyard. I don't really know. The evidence is just so thin, but it's an interesting possibility that may have actually disadvantaged these more mobile women who are working on the margins. I don't know. The records are so thin.
A question for the close observations of one of our participants today, Jennifer Darrell. She says the picture showed sugarcane. It does show sugarcane and pineapples. Would they have been grown? Yeah. She's asking if they would have been grown in Bermuda.
Pineapples, yes. Sugarcane by this point, I think probably no. Except in very limited quantities. Unfortunately, I've not had the chance to look at the picture in real close up in person. So that's a great. I wondered that whether the basket especially was pineapples, perhaps. Yeah, I don't think certainly, as you know, there's very early experiments with sugarcane which don't last very long. Whether those are revived, yeah, I'm not really sure about that. I don't know.
Yeah, we grow pineapples and they're small and they take a long time. So
yeah,
wherever they came from, they took some time. Another question from one of our guests, Jan McDonald. She's asking about the boats, likely from that St. George's painting. Where did the boats come from in Bermuda? It would have been an effort to sail a road from Pembroke or Paget, etc.
Yes, yeah. Now that is a bit beyond my knowledge. That small, what they call a bumboat in the Market Square, the St. George's painting, right? A locally made, almost certainly a vessel. The difference between that image and what was happening, of course, at Dockyard was that the women would have to sail there rather than row. And so I think that's where we have that interaction with male boatmen and the women as the marketers. And I think Mitchell gets it wrong, and he says the women are washerwomen and so on. But I think it's just because of his distance from the process. And so those are those vessels are likely small Bermuda vessels, right? As well, Bermuda built vessels as well. But I don't know the details. We just have so little information.
Well, you piece it together very well. I just want everybody to know that we really appreciate you giving us feedback. One of the things that the National Museum of Bermuda is committed to is its constant evolution and growth. And for us to do that, we need some input. So please connect with the survey that's in the chat. It just takes a few minutes. I think it's been timed at about 4 minutes. And we'd like to make sure that we're doing what we should be doing and doing it well. And if we can improve, we're willing to learn. And so that we would love that. It looks like I might have one more question, so just bear with me.
Okay.
Jennifer goes a comment. She's saying under closer examination, perhaps the pineapples might be screw palm fruits. Okay, question also from her is, do the museum or archives have any household account? Sorry, this is from Bruce Elliott, excuse me. Do the museum or archives have any household account books that might shed light on sales to permanent or temporary residents?
That's a great question. Not that I've seen, not in the archive. And as you likely know, there are, one of the striking things about the Bermuda archive is how few sort of personal or family collections there are in the Bermuda archive compared to other archives. And I think that's, in part the proximity of and persistence in place of families, that there's a bit of a privacy thing there going on. So there's surprisingly few records. I've been looking for what are very common in other colonial archives, estate plats. And so, detailed maps of properties when they're sold, and there's remarkably few for Bermuda. It's really quite surprising. The ones we do have show, the groves, the citrus groves, and the provision grounds, and so on. So they're quite useful, but there's surprisingly few of them compared to other places. For reasons that I don't entirely know, but I think have something to do with privacy and the persistence of the legal system, and so on. So account books would be wonderful, and absolutely, as you say, they would help us understand that both the income and what's the actual value of what's being traded here. And of course, value can mean things other than currency, right? It can mean symbolic value and exchange value and so on. But nonetheless, it would help us understand that. But I've not seen them. For sure. And I spent some time this summer looking through the assize court records, and what struck me there is the accusations in the governors and the assembly, the legislature records about theft, right, which are often quite racialized accusations. The Market Act begins with these accusations of persistence, threat, and so on. When you look at the assize court records, a very substantial proportion of the thefts are actually soldiers or garrison soldiers who are breaking into stores and stealing really quite small, often quite small quantities of things, which suggests something about desperation, I think, and failure to be paid or boredom or whatever it might be. But it's much more often soldiers than it is the kinds of people that the legislation would highlight or target.
We've got a comment from Meredith Eben. She comments that Bermudian dermatologist Dr. Alex Romeo is retiring this week, and he said that he was going to do some genealogy searching. So perhaps Mrs. Romeo was an ancestor.
That is wonderful.
Yeah, that is interesting.
Excellent. Oh, it'd be interesting to see the results of that. That's fantastic.
I feel like every lecture we do ends up circling us through genealogy. Like my story with Rosa Simons, with Meredith's comment about Dr. Romeo. I always think that as much as we learn about the past, it informs the present. When I was thinking about the drunken and disorderly falling off of boats, I don't think we've come too far. And in terms of the marketplace, I'm just sort of laughing a little bit about our annual raft ups, which are their own sort of strange procuring of market. But I think we've come to the, we try to keep it tight to the 6:30. I want to thank everybody. I want to thank everybody in advance for providing us some survey and feedback. Remember, please, that this lecture is recorded. It will be living online on our website and YouTube channel very soon. I want to thank you so much, Dr. Neil Kennedy. It's a pleasure. Also, always want to thank our team behind the scenes at the National Museum of Bermuda who work so hard. And thank you all the participants online for joining us. We also want to make sure a shout out to our sponsors again, and to all those who are investing in the legacy of the National Museum of Bermuda. So thank you all again, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you all. Thank you very much. And how appropriate to end with people. Our history should center, begin, and end with people.
Yeah. And a last parting shot too, if you have a minute, just to put one word into the chat to say, how did this lecture land on you? We would love to hear just that one word. Okay, Dr. Kennedy, you take care, and we'll see you again soon.
Excellent. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.